Today on the Energy Mixx Radio Show, we are digging into one of the most important issues shaping America's energy future, permitting reform. The invisible force that determines whether we can build the pipelines, LNG terminals, transmission lines, refineries, storage facilities, and emerging technologies that keeps this country running. And joining us is someone who sits at the center of the national conversation, Dustin Meyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economics, and Regulatory Affairs for the American Petroleum Institute, the organization representing every segment of America's oil and natural gas industry. API isn't just an advocacy group. For more than a century, it has set over 800 industry standards, supporting nearly 11 million American jobs, and helped ensure that the United States remains the world's leading energy producer. Their work touches everything from operational safety to environmental protection to the policies that determine whether we can build the infrastructure needed to meet the rising energy demand. Dustin, welcome to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We are honored to have you today.
I'm honored to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
So you have an exciting job. I think so. I think when you get to go and testify on behalf of one of the most important resources we have, a commodity that, quite frankly, I don't think we can live without. If it was to disappear tomorrow, we would really have a catastrophe like we've never seen before. So your job is interesting to help elected officials understand just how important energy is to national security, to our future. And so I'm glad you testified. And today we're going to talk about that on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And so why you're here is because the permitting system that once allowed America to build the Hoover Dam and the Empire State Building in record time has become a maze of delays, litigation, and political gamemanship. And those delays don't just hurt companies, they also raise the cost for families, weaken reliability, and jeopardize America's energy leadership. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, one, thank you again for having me on your show. And I think that captures it exactly right. I mean, we're just moving into a chapter of American history in which we have to be able to build big things, but we can't do that because the permitting process is so fundamentally broken. It impacts our industry, it impacts every part of the energy value chain, but it goes beyond just our industry. This is the reason why it takes so long to build roads, to repair bridges, to expand airports. There are so many different aspects of our economy that are negatively impacted by our broken permitting process. This is not the way it was intended to be. This is not the way the process worked in years past, but it's really devolved into a form of opposition, an obstacle to almost any infrastructure project in any region of the country. And that's why it's so important to get it fixed.
Okay, Callum, is my internet okay again? Sorry.
That's right.
Yeah, it's just your video is a little choppy, but your audio is coming through.
Okay, audio is important. We'll
Yeah,
work.
we sound good now.
Okay. So let me ask you if you can briefly go over, first of all, there are many listeners, Dustin, who are not familiar with API, which of course I am, and I should probably even use the letters, American Petroleum Institute. I'd like to give you just a few minutes. There's a lot to cover. So give me a little bit on API itself. So you guys do a lot of big things to help the energy industry. So tell us a little bit about API.
Yeah, we do. So we're the National Trade Association for the entirety of the U.S. oil and gas energy value chain. We are headquartered here in Washington, D.C. We have over 600 members. And what we strive to do is represent a unified view of the industry. And you can understand the value proposition of that. If you're a policymaker, if you're a legislator, be it at the federal level or at the state level, and you're considering a policy that you know is going to impact the industry, you could go try to talk to the thousands of individual companies that exist in this space and try to ascertain what the viewpoint is, or you could just go straight to API and get that unified view. And so that's why it's so important to have a well-resourced trade association like API. Our work actually extends a little bit beyond that. Not only do we represent the unified view of the industry in terms of advocating for the policies that we need to thrive, but we also set the standards for the industry, not just in the United States, but around the world. And when you travel globally and you're at a refinery in Europe or an offshore project in Brazil, it's amazing because you will find that they are building that project using API standards. And so that's a big role that we play to ensure the safety and integrity of operations all around the world. That's the dual mission of the American Petroleum Institute.
So give our listeners an update. I was fortunate enough to get the information on what you testified to Congress about, but kind of set it up before we get into permitting and the discipline making procedures and everything. Can you just give us a high level of what is happening right now and why were you testifying?
Yeah. So, API, again, what we do is we advocate for policies that are supported by the U.S. oil and gas industry. And in advance of the 2024 election, API came out with a roadmap for American energy leadership that was appropriate for whoever won the 2024 election. And it included 5 separate principles that we thought the next Congress and the next administration needed to act on in order to secure American energy leadership, not just for the next 2 years or 4 years, but for generations to come. And we're fortunate that with this Congress and with this administration, there's been a lot of momentum on a lot of those priorities. But rolling into 2026, the one priority that was still left out there was permitting reform. We have long believed that the country needs comprehensive permitting reform. We've long understood that that reform needs to be done legislatively. It needs to be done through Congress. There's not enough that the executive branch can do. And so that has been our number one priority for 2026, is working with both sides of the aisle to come up with a vision for comprehensive permitting reform. As I mentioned at the top, this is a priority for our industry, for the U.S. oil and gas industry, but it's not just our industry. This expands to every corner of the American economy would benefit from this. That's why there's a lot of momentum there. And that's why the United States Senate pulled together this hearing, was to get some more clarity as to what really is needed in a legislative package to fix the problems that our industry and so many others have been straddled with for the past 20 years.
And earlier, you said that it would affect all these different areas to just try to streamline the process. But give me an idea of, is there one specific project that you can list that is like the golden child of when this is a perfect example of why we need permit reform in the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many examples of that, unfortunately. But of course, the biggest one that everybody turns to quickly is Keystone XL, right? The Keystone XL pipeline is an oil pipeline designed to bring crude from Canada into the United States. We have dozens of crude oil pipelines running from Canada to the United States. We have dozens of natural gas pipelines doing the same thing. This has never been controversial. And still until about 15 years ago, when this became a headline grabbing issue, and the environmental review process, instead of taking the usual 6 to 9 months, ended up taking about 10 years. And then you had an administration in the first Trump term that wanted to do everything in their power to approve this pipeline, but somehow still couldn't get it done because there were challenges on the judicial level, and courts kept saying, no, that environmental review isn't good enough. And so they had to start back at square one. Finally, they got the permit approved. But then as soon as the next administration came in on day one, they tore up that approval. So here you have what should be a very non-controversial project that is similar to dozens of other projects that have existed for many, many years, that all of a sudden is held up in a broken permitting system. And after 10 years and billions of dollars, the project was ultimately abandoned. There are many other projects like that, including interstate natural gas pipelines that are designed to move gas from Pennsylvania into New England. We've had lease sales that are paused. We've had LNG export permits that are paused. the overall permitting system has been weaponized and it's been abused. And that's not the way the statutes were written. That's not the way it should work. But it really chills investment and it makes it difficult for us to build the projects that we know are needed. And yeah, this can be frustrating for the oil and gas industry that's trying to build these projects, but ultimately, it's the American consumers and it's American workers that pay the price, because these are workers who are lined up at the job site waiting to go to work, but can't do it until they get that final environmental review, right? It's energy that is going to be delivered into regions that so desperately need it that now won't get it because that project was canceled. That is why the process is so broken and why it's so important that we fix it.
And I want you to go over NEPA, but I do want to explain to the listener a little bit about who in the world could do business in an environment, in a climate in which would you, the listener, put together a business plan, a model, put in billions of dollars into it for 10 years, and it's just not going to ever get through permitting, so you just finally kill the job. In what way could any company exist in that kind of climate? And yet you mentioned we see this over and over and over and over again. And we remember the pipeline, all of the protest. It just gets so muddy, the water. It gets impossible to see, will it see the light of day? And so when companies are considering putting something together, they're looking at contracts, they're looking at being able to get through permitting, they're looking at this is the United States of America. We should be able to do this. And yet we don't see that. We saw it in Alaska. The Willow Project was another example of the companies. ConocoPhillips did the right job, did the right thing, just couldn't, and had a whole lot of had a very hard time getting it through. And when we have that kind of indecisive, when we have that kind of regulatory agencies that these companies are dealing with, that they don't know if they're going to make it through or not, companies stop investing in things like this. And this is why that permitting reform is so important.
Yeah.
We're going to go to break. When we return, though, Dustin, I'd like for you to I know there's some listeners, we have our regular listeners, but there's always, since this is Radio Land, I want you to kind of set up NEPA so everybody understands what that is and, why we know why you're testifying, but how is it going to change it almost seems like your words, discipline decision making to procedural paralysis. Great quote right there. We're literally paralyzed in how we do things. And what was the turning point that caused NEPA and other statutes to extend beyond their original purpose? So we're going to drill down in that. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Dustin Meyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economic, and Regulatory Affairs for the American Petroleum Institute. Dustin, before the break, thank you for helping us understand how truly hard it is for a company to get a progress of whether you're building a pipeline or an LNG facility. It's really hard. Any kind of business is struggling just because of the way the permitting is set up. So before the break, you were kind of discussing that. Now we know that you've testified to Congress to help them to understand how important reform is, specifically when we talk about energy. Can you tell us a little bit about, you said the permitting system has drifted from disciplined decision-making to procedural paralysis. What were the key turning points that caused NEPA and other statutes to extend or expand far beyond their original purpose? Give us some information on that.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's important to point out that everybody involved in this conversation, and certainly our industry, believes that there should absolutely be an environmental review process. And that process should be robust, and it should include public comment. And there should be legal recourse as well. That absolutely should exist. But that's not the process we have today. That's the way the process was intended to be run. And a lot of the statutes that we operate under now go back to the early 1970s. And it really does start with NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is often considered the nation's bedrock environmental law. And it's a good thing that NEPA exists. The country is better for it. But all NEPA was intended to do was to say, if you're building a significant federal project, there should be some analysis as to what the environmental impact should be from the construction and the operation of it. And the public, the community in which it's being built, they should probably have some information about the project. That is altogether reasonable. It was a procedural statute. It was only a couple of pages long. But what's happened over the ensuing 50 years is that it's devolved into a scheme in which the paralysis is the actual objective of the analysis. It is not really designed or interpreted anymore just to give the public a heads up that this project is happening. And, maybe if there's some issues that need to be addressed, a company can do that and everybody wins. The way that it's interpreted now is it's used as a roadblock to every type of infrastructure project. And you have to do this environmental review. And in the early days, an environmental review for a major project, maybe it would be 40 pages long, or maybe it would be 150 pages long. Well, now you have environmental review documents that are thousands of pages long that take, instead of, it takes us a couple of months to put together that review, now it'll take 4 years just to do the review. And then the agency will do this review. It'll be thousands of pages long. It took them 4 years to do. And yet, even that is deemed insufficient. And when they file that and say, okay, we've looked at this from every possible angle, and we think that this project should go forward, nope, it'll get challenged. Because somehow in those thousands of pages, well, you didn't consider
There's
this.
something in there.
Yep. What about this hypothetical? Did you consider this alternative? And for the agencies doing the work, it becomes this, never-ending quest to prove a negative, that you've looked at every possible alternative that is, conceivable by human minds, and it's just impossible to do. And yet that is what is required in order to get a permit. That's why the process now takes so much longer than what it originally did for the first, 20 or 30 years of the statute being in existence. And there's a real blueprint now. There's a roadmap for entities and organizations who are opposed to infrastructure of any sort. There's a playbook that they can follow to throw up all of these hurdles and all of these obstacles. And so often, one of the ironies here is that certainly we have a lot of instances in which major infrastructure projects have to run this gauntlet, and after years of delays and billions of dollars of cost overruns, they end up just walking away from it and they just cancel the project. We can't do this. That does happen. More
That's
common.
exactly what happened with Keystone.
That is exactly what happened. More common, actually, is that you do finally get a permit. It just takes you 6 years longer than what it should. But that's a reminder that the purpose of the opposition is not necessarily to improve environmental outcomes. It's just to slow down and delay the projects, because when you do that, you chill investment for future projects, because that's such an important thing here, right? It is difficult being the company that has an individual project that's being held up those permitting delays. And you can point to that project and say, this is the sort of investment that goes along with it. These are the jobs that go along with it. That's easy enough. What's lost in the conversation is how many projects go unproposed, because there's companies out there that, it would probably make sense if we could build this pipeline from point A to point B, but think of all of the regulatory steps that we would have to do, and that's going to be really expensive, and it's going to take a long time, and I don't know if we could actually end up building this project. I'm not even going to bother proposing that. That's the real unintended, frankly, it's the intended consequence of this, is to chill investment in those sorts of things. And that's not the way the system was designed. That's not the way that the original laws here were designed and written. And so that's why we need reform to bring it back to a much more common sense approach that fundamentally understands that this country needs to be able to build big things. And so that's really the motivation behind everything that we're asking for.
Well, we're going to come back from break here shortly. And this is not API. This is Kym Bolado saying it in the way of, if we start really thinking about if these projects cannot get all the way through the permitting process, and the company can now begin the process, and they're safe, and they've been given everything to go do their job, wouldn't it make sense that if we're not doing it here, some other country is going to fill that vacuum? And that country, I promise you, doesn't have an EPA. They don't have Waters of America. They don't have a lot of regulatory oversight. And so if these environmentalists want to sit here and slow down these projects and say it's because of the environment, so how does it help the environment if another country is doing these jobs in oil and gas and they have less regulation than what the United States does? It makes no sense. It's just a very dishonest conversation. That's Kym saying it. And I wanted the listeners to understand we have to think about it. What's the goal here? And you're going to talk to us about getting back on the regulatory end of it. But I just wanted our listeners to understand there's reasons why they're doing this, and we need to get back into the place where we need to be, where work gets done, like you said. Dustin, let's take a quick break. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Dustin Meyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economics, and Regulatory Affairs for American Petroleum Institute. Dustin, I have a question. We're going to get back on, the purpose, because it is important that you're testifying. If Congress is going to make some changes and try to do regulatory reform, it's real important they understand the problems, and there is no better agency or organization than yours. So you guys have been setting standards and guidelines in the industry for more than a century. How has API's role evolved as permitting has become one of the biggest barriers to building modern energy infrastructure? Like, have you all noticed? I mean, I know you have noticed, but in what ways are you seeing that you're having to evolve? Because the game is changing on you guys.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's a number of examples of that. One, there is a lot of progress that's being made. We completely agree. As I mentioned earlier, there should be an environmental review process. It should be robust. The company or the communities that we operate in should trust that our projects are going to be safe. Standards play an important role in that. And there's so much progress that we've made in terms of ensuring the safety and integrity of our operations and bolstering our relationships with the communities that we operate in. And so often it's the case that the communities in which the project is proposed, they're the most supportive of the project. The opposition comes from outside groups who don't get to experience the benefits, the economic benefits, the tax revenues, the job creation that comes along with having an industry footprint nearby. And so that often gets lost, but it is, of course, important for us to continue to make progress on that. But on the advocacy front, that's why we've worked so hard to understand the nature of the problem, why the process is so broken, and be crystal clear about what the actual solutions are, because that's what lawmakers are ultimately looking for. They need clarity as to if we're going to go through all of the work and politicking to actually get a piece of legislation together and get it passed and signed by the president, we want to make darn sure that it achieves its intended objective and it actually fixes the problem. And that's why it's so important for an industry like ours to be very clear and very proactive that this is what we need, this is why we need it. And I think that we've done a really nice job of doing that. And I think the hearing was a good example of a bipartisan group of senators, including senators who aren't necessarily known for having a fond view of the oil and gas industry. They too agree and understand with the foundational premise, which is that the permitting system is fundamentally broken and we have to fix it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier in the show, Dustin, that it isn't just oil and gas that needs reform. We're looking at all these different projects. So your testimony highlights that America was once built the Hoover Dam in 5 years and the Empire State Building in just over a year. What does this historical comparison reveal about how far today's permitting system has fallen behind and the nation's needs? And so if there's somebody here who's not a fan of oil and gas, which I have those too, listeners, if you don't understand reform, then should these type of projects also fall behind? And we're going to get into AI on the next question. So tell me your thoughts on this energy reform. Can we build any project? Because it's just
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, what you have is a situation now in which every industry knows that if you're considering a project that triggers a federal environmental review, it is going to be a gauntlet that you're going to have to walk for many years before you even put a shovel in the ground. A lot of, especially within the labor community, they bemoan the fact that these projects spend more time in the courtroom than they do at the actual construction site, because that's the way the time is split up. And so it absolutely impacts everything from a new bridge to a new airport to a new highway to absolutely a new pipeline. And there's so many examples. I mean, you almost marvel at our ability in the past to build these projects so quickly. We have a big pipeline up in Alaska that runs from the North Slope all the way down to Anchorage, 700 miles long, enormously complex to build. We were able to build that in about a year and a half or so. That's simply unthinkable today, even though we benefit from having so much more modern technology. And, we should be able to do it even faster today than what we were able to do it in 1978. But the reality is exactly the opposite. It just takes so long because of the permitting process every step along the way. A big problem with this, Kym, is, the opposition and the obstacles, they don't just impact you at the beginning of the process. It's at every single step, including after you get the permit itself. We have multiple examples of projects that, okay, they ran that gauntlet. It took them 5 years, but they finally got their permit. They began construction, and maybe they even went into operation. And then a new legal file was challenged in a court. Some faraway court decided, actually, we're going to vacate your permit, stop your operations, and force you to start the process all over again. So
That
you
is a
talk about investment uncertainty. How can you possibly manage that when you're making decisions about how to allocate capital? And you brought up a great point earlier that, okay, our permitting process is broken. Well, there's a lot of other countries, including some countries that we're competing very strongly against, where they don't have this problem. They can move fast and they can build this big infrastructure in a modern way. At 3 times the speed that we can. And so it's a competitive disadvantage, and it has serious national security implications beyond just our energy security and our affordability concerns.
So we're going to go to break, but I want to clear this up for the listeners and even myself. So some people in the United States really think that we have these problems with energy and that we, maybe don't need reform or it's fine the way it is. We need to look at all of the environmental impacts. But when we were doing this with the Hoover Dam and the Empire State Building and millions of pipeline that already exist in the United States underground and highways and we were fine in the environment. We survived it. Then I guess we're supposed to not build anything anymore. We don't build any high skyscrapers. We don't build any more freeways and then if that hasn't made your head spin, these people think this way. What are we going to do when we talk about now these AI and data centers that are coming in? How are we going to fill that? And I'm not going to let you answer it right now because I got to go to a break. But when we return, I would love for you to tell me, how are we going to do all this? And what are these people thinking? You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Dustin Meyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economic, Regulatory Affairs for the American Petroleum Institute. Dustin, I love doing this show because it's insanity when I'm covering what I'm covering. And it makes my mind explode of like, wow, people really think this. And so I think that's either maybe money is coming from other countries to make us just this dumb, to make us not logically think about what are we doing to ourselves. But oh well, hell, let's get into energy demand because it's exploding, right? Especially with AI data centers and reshoring the American manufacturing industry. How urgent is this moment, and what happens if permitting reform doesn't keep pace with the surge of demand? And also, I want to remind you that, like President Trump or not, He is trying. He would come back from Pennsylvania and sign three executive orders, and one of them was to try to clear the pathway for regulatory reform, but it has to be done at Congress. So, what are we going to do with this energy demand that's exploding?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we call the next 10 years ahead, we refer to it as the demand decade because the pace and the magnitude of energy demand growth that we're going to experience is simply unprecedented. And we talk a lot about AI and what that means for electricity demand, and indeed that could be a paradigm shift. But it's not just electricity. This is liquid fuels as well for transportation, plane travel. This is natural gas for home heating as well as electricity generation. So this is an across the board increase in overall energy demand. And we're going to have to be able to build the new capacity to meet that demand. There's so much of what we do right now that is effectively coasting on all of the infrastructure that we built several decades ago. And there's a limit to how long you can do that. And I think we're getting very close to where that limit is. That's why there's so much urgency here. And the conversation has changed a lot over just the last couple of years. When you think about the nature of the opposition to individual infrastructure projects or being opposed to the notion of comprehensive permitting reform, it's often motivated by two equally misguided perspectives. The first is just a blanket opposition to building any infrastructure anywhere for any reason at any time, right? The second is a misguided belief that restricting supply for energy, in this instance, oil and gas, will therefore reduce demand and reduce emissions. And nothing could be further from the truth. All of it, reducing supply does not reduce demand. All it does is increase prices and increase volatility. There is, I believe, a greater appreciation in the conversation writ large today that energy demand is probably going to increase. Is a couple of years ago, there were a lot of people who probably should have known better who started to believe that oil and gas demand, it's already peaked, it's probably going to plummet, and if the demand isn't going to be there, why do we need to build new infrastructure? Why do we need to invest in new supply? I think most common sense people have moved beyond that philosophy. They understand the demand is going to be there. And I think that's why you do have general buy-in as to the premise and the need for something like permitting reform. But it's a question of aligning the politics on the specific fixes and getting it done. And that, unfortunately, is going to prove challenging because Washington is Washington, and there's all sorts of incentives to preserve a problem instead of fixing the problem. We're very focused on fixing the problem. We've got a great plan for doing that. That would benefit, again, not just our industry, but every industry. It would benefit elected officials from both parties. Whoever could be part of ensuring that this piece of legislation becomes law, that would be a political win for them. So that's our message: is take advantage of this moment, seize this moment, and take the win.
Absolutely. I'm going to try to get us back on track because I can go off on tangents, Dustin, on who is funding these people and what are they thinking and why are they thinking it and how do we supply energy to our allies. But I'm going to bring it back home again. I'm going to calm down, bring it back home. You mentioned that NEPA and in your testimony and the Clean Water Act are being weaponized. And I have heard that in the years that I've been covering energy from pretty much wanting in the Clean Water Act to regulate puddles after a rainstorm. It can get pretty dicey when we talk about the Clean Water Act. Can you explain how these laws, originally designed for environmental protection, are now being used to block projects that have minimal environmental impacts? This is it at the end of the day. What are they doing?
Yeah, so I'll give you two great tangible examples, first on NEPA and then on Clean Water Act. For something like NEPA, what so often happens is you have a small pipeline. It could be a 30-mile pipeline that the regulating agency is now put in responsibility for effectively knowing the future and predicting not just what will the environmental impact be of the physical project itself, but all of the products that are delivered by that pipeline in global markets over the next 40 years. And what
Could they
does
bring in
that
the lottery
mean?
numbers too, since they can read
Right.
the future?
Yeah. And so it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to get that level of analysis completed in a way that everybody agrees with. And so that's a great example of NEPA being abused. That's not what NEPA was intended for. NEPA was intended to look at just the actual impacts of the physical project itself in knowable space and time, not predicting the future. The Clean Water Act has also been weaponized. There is a part of the Clean Water Act that gives states a very limited authority to ensure that a project moving through their territory doesn't result in a water discharge that throws out their overall water certification based on their state rules, right? That's fairly reasonable. Cooperative federalism, states should have a bit of a role to play in this. The way that it's been interpreted over the last 20 years is that states are using that limited authority as a veto on projects that they disfavor politically for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with actual water quality impacts. So those are two obvious ways in which the current interpretation of these statutes is way out of sync with their original statutory intent.
Yep.
They've resulted in billions of dollars of projects being canceled or delayed, and that's why it has to be fixed.
Absolutely. And we're going to go to break here, but when we return, there's Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, and it has become a choke point for natural gas pipelines. And your question when we return was, how was this provision stated to block critical infrastructure, and what reforms are needed to restore its original intent? And the reason why that is an important question to me is we keep talking about keeping the lights on and utilities, but where do the people who does not understand that the majority of this is the natural gas pipelines, natural gas? So if we're not doing infrastructure, we're not going to be able to keep up with even the utilities. If you're addicted to AI or GPT chat, as I am, that's gone, folks. Okay. But so is your lights, and so is your air conditioners. I mean, we got to have natural gas. We have to have this. It's part of the fuels that we need. And so when we return from break, I want you to explain to us what Section 401 is of the Clean Water Act. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Dustin Meyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economic, and Regulatory Affairs for American Petroleum Institute. Justin, we have one segment left. I'm going to try to cram. I'm sorry, Dustin, we have one segment left. I'm trying to cram as much as I can into it. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act has become a choke point for natural gas pipelines. Please tell me how the states use this provision to block critical infrastructure and what reforms are needed to restore its original intent.
Yeah, so the hallmark example of this is everybody knows that the state of Pennsylvania is a natural gas superpower. If Pennsylvania were a country, it would be the world's sixth largest producer of natural gas. They have so much gas, but they can't transport that gas to New England. And so as a result, Pennsylvania has very cheap natural gas prices. New England has very expensive natural gas prices, which means that they have very expensive home heating. And they also have very expensive electricity because you use natural gas to generate electricity. The obvious thing to do is build a natural gas pipeline or two or three from Pennsylvania through New York into New England. But for the last 20 years, even though that's an obvious solution, you've been prevented from doing so because those states oppose new natural gas infrastructure. They don't technically have the authority to do that for something that's interstate, but they are weaponizing this very narrow part of the Clean Water Act, which is Section 401, to veto the projects that they don't like. Again, not only is that frustrating to our industry, but the consumers in New England ultimately pay the price. And, you've seen over the last week when we had this nasty stretch of incredibly cold weather up and down the eastern seaboard, how expensive electricity, how expensive energy gets in those parts. That could all be alleviated if you could just build the natural gas infrastructure. You could do that if you fix Section 401 of the Clean Water Act.
Let's switch gears and talk about judicial review and what is some of the biggest problems in proportionate remedies that you feel that we need to be looking at to build projects faster, to hold these people accountable for, I guess, holding up these projects, killing these projects. Is that on the table as well? Judicial
Yeah,
review?
absolutely. That's the third part of our vision for what permitting reform needs to include, because
Hold
right
people
now the way,
accountable.
yeah, right now the way that the process works is that anyone at any time in anywhere can effectively legally challenge a major infrastructure project. And this is both during the permitting process, it's during the construction process, and sometimes even during the actual operation of the project. And so that has to be narrowed in a common sense way to end the frivolous litigation that is endless. Because if you're a
Yes.
project developer, the way that it works in practice is you'll get a legal challenge and you'll fight it. And often you will eventually win. And then as soon as you win that one, guess what? A new legal challenge pops up. And you play this game over and over again for years, and your project ends up getting delayed. That is why it's so important to end this nonstop frivolous litigation. There's also a way that courts, when there are legitimate concerns about a permit, that doesn't mean that a court should totally vacate the entire foundational permit and force a project to start back at square one. They should instead just focus on the narrow little deficiency that they found, give the agency a couple months to fix it. Okay, now the problem is solved and everything can get back to normal. So that's another big part of the fix when it comes to ending frivolous litigation.
Absolutely. You see that in the courtrooms over and over and over again. You just don't have a runaway train where you can bring out anything you want. It's got to be fact-based and how does this pertain to what we're here litigating. Yet it seems like over here it doesn't matter. It's whatever you want to throw in, including the kitchen sink, go ahead. Let's talk
Yep.
about the AI boom. It's making, of course, natural gas indispensable again, as I mentioned earlier in the show. And Texas just approved the largest gas-powered project in U.S. history. How do these projects illustrate the need for federal permitting reform, and how can we possibly meet these AI demands? And I'm telling you, seriously, Dustin, no one better take away GPT chat. I live by it now. I need it. It makes us all smarter. It
It's
helps
an
with
it's
the show.
yeah.
How do we fix the permitting system now? What
Yeah,
timelines are we on?
it's an incredible tool and you can understand the value of it. And that is what is driving this unprecedented uptick in overall energy demand and electricity demand specifically. And when you talk to a lot of these hyperscalers, they will be very open about the fact that the limiting factor that they're primarily concerned with is energy availability. Right. And so, if we want to meet the demands of the future, the demand that we as consumers expect, the value that we expect to get out of these things, we have to be able to build the infrastructure that meets that demand. If we don't, what's going to happen is a continuation of the trend that we've seen over the last couple of years is, well, the demand is increasing, but the supply can't keep pace. And the way that that equation solves itself is that prices go up. And so electricity prices across the country are going up. People are getting frustrated. Our message is if electricity prices are the problem, permitting reform is the solution. It's that simple. And that's what we need to do is bring this together and make sure that we can build that capacity.
And I hope that everybody gets addicted to AI like I am because they will definitely ask for permitting reform.
Absolutely.
Okay, this conversation highlights something that every American needs to understand, and that is that energy just doesn't appear. It has to be produced, transported, stored, refined, and delivered, and that requires infrastructure. And when permitting systems work, America leads the world in affordable, reliable, clean energy. And when it doesn't, families pay more, like you said earlier. Businesses hesitate to invest, and our allies look elsewhere. Thank you for your testimony before Congress because you made it clear that it isn't about cutting corners. It's about restoring common sense, predictability, and the ability to build. Before I let you go, how can people get involved to help API? We need energy reform.
Yeah, and that's so important, Kym, because we try our best to be a loud and unified and compelling voice for the industry. But at the end of the day, it's consumers who really matter here. It's energy workers who really matter, and so we work very hard to make sure that they have a voice as well. if you go to api.org, you can sign up to be an Energy Citizens and get plugged into a lot of these conversations. And you often have the opportunity to engage with elected officials at the local, state, or even federal level to make them understand how important energy is to you, how important it is to your career, to your family's well-being, to your day-to-day ability to afford the lifestyle that you want to live. Those are exactly the voices that we're trying to elevate. So I really do encourage all of your listeners to go to api.org and sign up to be an Energy Citizen.
And you know, the thing is, most people really don't understand unless you've been through it, that it is very exciting to contact your elected official in your area and give them your thoughts, or maybe even showing up in DC to actually get involved and engaged with the process. And we see this happening all over the TV in different places, in different areas, and different projects, right? So I'm not trying to bring anything else besides energy into this show, but it is about getting involved in what you believe in. And anybody who believes that letting China, Russia, or other countries produce energy and we are a secondary, they don't understand that this is a matter of national security as well. We should have and be the leaders in energy, period. We have all the regulatory oversight, but we need to bring them back in and help continue to produce this energy. And so I can't think of a better association besides API that you guys really have a handle on it at DC where it's needed the most. So again, listeners, api.org, go on their website, sign up for their citizens, energy citizens. What is it again?
Energy Citizens.
Okay. Sign up for Energy Citizens. And again, thank you for joining me on the show. When you go testify, please keep us in the loop and let us know. I'm looking forward to hopefully looking at some energy reform. I've been doing this for 14 years, and for 14 years, we've been saying we need energy reform.
Absolutely. The time is
let's
now.
Get this done.
This is the window. We got to do it.
Yes. Thank you, Dustin, for joining me today on the Energy Mixx Radio Show.
Thank you, Kym, so much for having us. Hope to talk again soon.